You thought Harley's worst threat would come from a rival cruiser, but it came from inside a lab, built by rogue engineers with nothing to lose. The result? An engine so advanced it broke every rule. Stick around till the end, because what happens next could tear the motorcycle world in two. A mutiny on the track. It didn't happen at a trade show. It didn't launch with a press release. It detonated quietly and without warning during a regional track day in Nevada. The bike looked unassuming. No decals, no flashy carbon, no exotic paint. But the sound? It stopped the paddock cold. At first, riders mistook it for a tuned Harley, maybe a custom S&S build. Then it launched. Riders looked at each other silent, stunned. No warning, no marketing, just raw performance that punched tradition in the throat and left Harley's best choking on smoke. What followed was chaos. Riders who had just run their hot laps stood along the wall, jaws slack. The torque delivery wasn't just sharp, it was instant, violent, controlled. It didn't lift the front wheel in a stunt. It drove it into the pavement with such force the forks visibly compressed. And when it cleared the first straightaway, people stopped guessing what it was. Because nothing in Harley's catalog, not the CVO, not the 131, not even the heavily modded V-rods, moved like that. What no one knew then was that the engine powering that sleeper prototype wasn't American. It came from overseas. A company better known for refined balance, not brute strength. But this wasn't refinement. It was rage, tamed just enough to pass emissions and tuned just enough to terrorize the V-twin throne. And when the lap times came in, that's when Harley fans felt it in their gut. They'd just been dethroned. Yet the real twist wasn't what happened on the track, it was why it happened at all. It wasn't performance. It was obsession. The company behind the engine, Shinsei Motors, had no heritage in American-style muscle. Known globally for surgical precision and hybrid innovation, they'd never cared about noise, rumble, or identity. But 5 years ago, something changed. A group of rogue engineers inside Shinsei's performance skunk works grew obsessed with the question, what if we didn't just match Harley's output? What if we erased it? It started in secret, unfunded, unapproved, and unsanctioned. Engineers took time off official projects to build prototypes in an abandoned assembly wing. The budget came out of pocket. The dyno runs were logged manually. They called it Project Urai, a word meaning ghost, because this engine wasn't supposed to exist. Not by corporate standards, not by market trends, and certainly not by Shinsei's image of clean, polite performance. This wasn't strategy. It was obsession with proving that sound and power didn't need heritage to feel iconic. It wasn't about legacy. It was about legacy's replacement. The team wasn't chasing a market, they were chasing revenge. Half of them had grown up idolizing brands like Harley. Then they watched them stagnate. While Harley tripled down on heritage branding and overpriced chrome, the Urai team saw an opening. A chance to reintroduce combustion not as nostalgia, but as insurgency. By the time Shinsei's executives discovered the engine, it was already outperforming their entire production line. And instead of shutting it down, they did something unthinkable. They gave it a green light. Behind closed doors, engineers were breaking not just limits, but laws of convention. If this already feels bigger than horsepower, if it feels like Harley just got blindsided, hit that like button to keep this story alive. And tell us in the comments, is this the beginning of a revolution or the end of an era? Your take might be the one that sparks the next big debate. Rules they broke, engine they built. What made the Urai engine terrifying wasn't just its numbers, it was how those numbers were achieved. Shinsei engineers didn't follow playbooks, they tore them up. They ditched legacy cooling systems for a patented split-phase liquid loop that reduced thermal load by over 40%. They integrated a carbon nanotube-lined combustion chamber, something previously reserved for aerospace, allowing compression ratios that would detonate any standard piston. The intake geometry was variable and active. The ECU wasn't off the shelf, it was neural-assisted learning from each ride. And the noise? Tuned to hit a frequency range that registered more in the chest than the ear. It didn't just sound fast, it felt like a bomb under throttle. But perhaps the boldest move was compliance. Somehow this beast, capable of wheelie torque and touring chassis, passed Euro 5 and carb standards without modifiers. It didn't skirt emissions, it crushed them. Dyno tested at peak output with full legality, it left Harley's 135 looking like a relic. Harley fans scoffed at first. No engine that clean could be that brutal, until teardown videos started surfacing, and what viewers saw defied logic. No shortcuts, no cheating, just brilliance and danger. Because if Shinsei could build that engine, who else might follow? And if the tech sent shockwaves, the price tag turned them into a full-blown quake. Looking at bikes this simple and this solid, there's no excuse to overpay for overcomplicated gear. That's why we've lined up jackets, helmets, gloves, and tools that match these bikes in price and purpose. No fluff, just what works. Hit the link in the description to check out our trusted gear list. The engine that broke the price barrier, $8,000. That was the announced retail for the Urai crate engine, and it hit the market like a punch to the throat. For that price, riders weren't just getting world-class torque, they were getting it in a package that embarrassed Harley's entire upgrade ecosystem. Performance shops were the first to panic. For decades, they'd made a living retrofitting Harleys with custom cams, big-bore kits, and high-flow exhausts. A serious build could cost $12,000 to $15,000 easily. The Urai engine delivered more power, more efficiency, and more reliability for nearly half. Turnkey, plug-in, legal. Then the ripple hit the dealers. Orders slowed, deposits were pulled. Harley's pipeline of loyal buyers, once dependable, even fanatical, began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why spend more for less? Why wait for outdated platforms when something faster, lighter, and cleaner was shipping now? The aftermarket world cracked next. Brands built around the V-twin platform, S&S, Vance and Hines, Thundermax, began slashing prices. Forums turned toxic. YouTube techs flipped allegiances. For the first time in modern motorcycle history, Harley wasn't just behind. They were irrelevant. And the worst part? Shinsei hadn't even marketed it yet. The pricing shattered more than margins. It shattered belief. Riders didn't need weekend tuning anymore. They needed a phone and financing. The aftermarket suddenly felt prehistoric. Because the next phase wasn't about selling engines, it was about selling the end of the V-twin era. Harley's target: denial. Publicly, Harley-Davidson did what legacy companies always do when confronted with disruption. They dismissed it. Executives called Shinsei's Urai engine a short-term stunt, a track gimmick, a non-event for real riders. Their messaging hit every familiar note: heritage, culture, loyalty. They emphasized community over numbers, sound over speed. The word authenticity showed up in every press release, as if horsepower were a marketing illusion, not a measurable reality. Calling it a stunt didn't stop the footage. Riders were replaying dyno runs and drag pulls in disbelief. This wasn't hype, it was a hard reset on reality. But inside the community, something was shifting. Riders weren't dumb. They'd seen the teardown videos. They'd watched the track footage. The Urai didn't just beat Harley's best, it embarrassed it. Still, the company held its ground, rolling out special edition chrome packages and flag-waving ads as if patriotism could outpace torque curves. Even dealerships felt the awkwardness. Salespeople were handed scripts to counter Urai comparisons, but those scripts unraveled fast when customers walked in with data. The truth was simple. Harley couldn't match the engine and it couldn't buy time. So it did what it could. It doubled down on denial. But that approach wasn't just risky, it was radioactive. Because while Harley spun the story, its leadership was breaking apart from the inside. While Harley talked tough in public, its leadership was quietly tearing itself apart. Executives at war. The boardroom was silent at first, but as the Urai engine's numbers went viral, the cracks formed fast. The marketing team wanted spin. The engineers wanted answers. And the finance department? They wanted blood. Old guard leaders whispered about betrayal. Younger execs talked future or failure. The brand was no longer unified. It was eating itself in slow, polite internal collapse. Half the C-suite believed Harley needed to pivot. Fast, not just in performance, but in identity. The other half argued the opposite, that chasing Shinsei would betray the brand's soul. What followed was a full-blown civil war inside the company's highest floors. One faction pushed for a stripped-down performance line to compete head-on. Another insisted on building an all-new platform. Still others clung to the hope that Shinsei's engine was a one-off, a fluke. Meetings dragged for hours. Product teams refused to coordinate. Morale cratered on the engineering floor. Worse, no one could agree on messaging. Every leaked internal memo sent the community deeper into speculation. Even trusted Harley insiders began whispering online, "We were blindsided." The people who once led the American motorcycling conversation were now arguing over whether they even belonged in it. And then came the Hail Mary. When Harley couldn't outbuild the threat, they tried to out-legislate it. Desperation rarely breeds innovation, but it often triggers retaliation. How to stop a legal engine. The Urai engine was powerful, clean, and ready to ship. That's what made it dangerous. Harley's legal team saw the threat clearly. This wasn't a patent issue. It wasn't emissions loopholes. It was horrifyingly fully compliant. So they pivoted. Instead of questioning the engine's legality, they questioned the process. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a lifeline. If compliance couldn't be attacked, maybe bureaucracy could. Harley didn't need to win. They just needed to stall. Harley lobbied for an investigation into Shinsei's certification paperwork. They asked regulators to re-examine dyno testing methods, supplier material sourcing, and cold start emissions under urban conditions. They claimed the engine's performance curve implied irregular compression, a potential sign of borderline tuning. None of it was provable. All of it was plausible. Behind the scenes, Harley leaned hard into their Washington contacts. Meetings were requested, trade commissions were briefed, EPA inspectors were nudged, but there was a problem. The Urai engine had been built too well. It was too clean, too documented, too bulletproof. Worse, Shinsei leaned into transparency. They released certification data publicly. They invited EPA reps to tour their test labs. Their engineers gave interviews in fluent English, calling Harley's challenge a nostalgic attempt to delay the inevitable. Harley's gambit failed. And worse, it made them look scared. That perception rippled fast through rider communities. As legal salvos failed to land, Harley's real reckoning came from its own backyard. The fan base splits. The betrayal didn't come from regulators. It came from the forums, the riders, the YouTubers, the people who had tattooed the bar and shield on their shoulders and built their identities around the V-twin mythos. Riders who once defended Harley without question began asking the unthinkable. What if the loyalty they showed wasn't returned? What if the betrayal wasn't technical? It was cultural. For years, those loyalists had defended Harley's slow evolution, its premium pricing, its design conservatism. They believed in the brand, even when it didn't believe in them. But the Urai changed everything. Not because it was foreign, not because it was better, but because it exposed the truth. Harley could have done this. It simply chose not to. The fallout was immediate. Some riders doubled down, calling the Urai soulless and corporate noise. They posted photos of their Harleys with flags and hashtags like #stay loud. But others saw through it. They asked a different question. Why are we defending a brand that stopped defending us? YouTube exploded with comparison videos. Instagram feeds turned hostile. Dealerships reported tense debates in showrooms. Fathers and sons arguing over what real performance meant. The V-twin community fractured overnight. What had once been a tribe became a civil war. And in the silence that followed, only one thing was clear. Harley wasn't leading the conversation anymore. It was reacting to it. Because once the fans split, the industry followed, and what came next wasn't imitation. It was escalation. Riders rallied behind the underdog. They weren't supposed to care. The rival brand, Shinsei, wasn't cool. It wasn't American. It didn't carry rebellion in its DNA. But the moment the Urai engine hit the streets, something shifted. It wasn't just the performance, it was the spirit behind it. The engine was fast, yes, but more than that, it was fearless. This wasn't a brand shift, it was a movement. One built on adrenaline, not ad copy. For the first time in decades, speed was the identity again. For younger riders, it represented something Harley had failed to deliver for years: progress without apology. It didn't talk about respecting heritage or preserving tradition, it just moved, and it moved like hell. Riders under 30, the same demographic Harley struggled to reach, now lined up to test ride the bike that had once been laughed off as a gimmick. TikTok exploded with raw pulls and first impressions. "This is what riding should feel like," one user shouted over the Urai's growl. Forum signatures changed, Facebook groups splintered. In cities across Europe, Asia, and the United States, pop-up meetups began forming around the Shinsei community. Some organized by longtime Harley fans, now converted. It wasn't just a shift in preference, it was a migration. A generation that had once shrugged at cruisers now found their entry point, not through marketing, but through mechanical shock. The roar of new riders was soon drowned out by the crumbling noise of Harley's supply chain. Harley's supply chain quakes. The Urai engine didn't just challenge Harley, it vaporized its supporting ecosystem. The moment Shinsei announced dealer integration partnerships with key powertrain distributors, the ripple began. Harley's aftermarket vendors, once shielded by brand loyalty, were suddenly exposed. Harley had propped up an entire economy of bolt-ons and dyno shops. Now those same garages were asking if they were building bikes or maintaining fossils. Performance shops that had built their names on V-twin upgrades began reporting cancellations. Pre-orders dried up. Orders for big-bore kits, cams, tuners, and air intakes dropped by double digits in a matter of weeks. In some regions, that dip turned into freefall. And it wasn't just Harley feeling the heat. Indian Motorcycles, long positioned as Harley's fiercest domestic rival, held emergency meetings about how to respond. Their performance line, once aggressive and fresh, suddenly looked tame compared to what Shinsei had released. Even Honda, the quiet titan of consistency, began reshaping its global development roadmap, because what Urai had done wasn't incremental, it was foundational. Shinsei didn't just sell engines, they offered manufacturers a new bar to meet, or lose to. And as OEMs scrambled to reverse engineer the Urai or build something better, supply chains pivoted. Machine shops, casting houses, electronics firms all began receiving new specs. Orders changed, priorities changed, loyalty evaporated. Harley's once dominant ecosystem began to feel like a house built on shifting sand. And before anyone could brace for it, the industry's most guarded secret went public. Blueprints. Leak. Power is copied. For a while, Shinsei held the high ground. The Urai engine was their crown jewel, sealed behind patents, manufacturing security, and proprietary firmware. But in the digital age, there are no real secrets. 3 months after launch, the blueprints leaked. No one knows how it happened. A supplier breach, a firmware dump, maybe even a disgruntled engineer. What mattered is this. Within 72 hours, the internal architecture of the Urai was in the wild, shared on encrypted forums, translated, annotated, reverse-modeled. Clone projects appeared overnight. Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, even a California-based startup all claimed to have working prototypes based on the leaked tech. Some were rough, others were disturbingly accurate, and none of them had to spend years on R&D. The path had already been cleared for them and anyone else with a CNC machine and ambition. Shinsei's legal team responded fast. Takedowns were issued, lawsuits filed, but the damage was done. Their miracle engine had become open-source inspiration, and the more people who copied it, the more pressure Harley faced to justify its existence. Because now the question wasn't just, why didn't you build this? It became, why can't you even copy it? Even as copies multiplied, governments began drawing their own red lines. Performance versus policy. Even as Shinsei's engine earned global admiration, it stepped directly into a firestorm, one Harley had managed to dodge for years. The combustion debate. Governments in Europe, California, and parts of Asia had already begun phasing out new gas-powered vehicles, and now they saw the Urai as the wrong kind of breakthrough. It was too good, too clean, too fast, too loud. In Brussels, lawmakers worried it would reignite the performance market just as policy aimed to phase it out. In Berlin, environmental advocates called it technological backsliding. In California, the Air Resources Board reviewed its certification twice, searching not for violations, but for reasons to delay mass adoption. The message was clear. This engine might have passed the letter of the law, but it violated the spirit of the transition. Shinsei pushed back, claiming their design offered lower lifecycle emissions than most hybrids. They even offered to release an electric variant eventually. But the headlines had already hit. Activists branded it a loophole. Politicians labeled it a threat. And for Harley, this wasn't good news. It was a window. A chance to pivot public attention away from their own failures and toward regulation itself. But if they hoped that regulators might stop the Urai, they were already too late. Because while governments debated, the culture had already chosen its direction, and Harley wasn't driving anymore. Union lines are drawn. Inside Harley's domestic plants, the tension turned physical. Assembly lines slowed. Whispers turned to arguments. Workers, many of whom had given decades to the factory floors of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, began to ask questions their managers couldn't answer. Would this engine kill their jobs? Was the company planning to offshore development again? Would union contracts still matter if the bikes they were building didn't sell? The reality was brutal. Layoffs were being discussed. Some departments saw hiring freezes. Others had tooling upgrades halted mid-process. And it wasn't just hourly workers who were anxious. Middle management knew they were next in the blast radius if sales didn't rebound. For union leaders, the Urai engine represented more than market competition. It was a wedge. It showed that another company could build something brilliant without nostalgia or patriotism. And that terrified them. Because if riders no longer cared about where a bike was made or by whom, then American-made wasn't leverage. It was a liability. Emergency meetings were held, demands were issued. Harley responded with cautious language about strategic patience. But on the factory floor, patience was gone. The workers had done their part. The machines ran. The bikes shipped. It wasn't labor that failed, it was leadership. While assembly lines slowed, the cold truth showed up where it always does, on the sales charts. Market vote. Riders shift. The sales reports hit like a hammer. First quarter orders for Harley's core models were down 17%. The Softail platform, once the brand's backbone, was losing volume to street fighters and mid-weight imports. But the most telling statistic? Average rider age. For the first time in modern history, Harley's customer base aged upward. They weren't gaining new riders, they were aging out. Meanwhile, Shinsei's Urai-equipped units sold out globally. Dealers requested double the original allotment. Wait lists formed. And what rattled analysts wasn't just the demand, it was the diversity. Riders in their 20s and 30s, first-time owners, women, urban commuters, people who had never even considered combustion motorcycles were lining up for test rides. Harley tried to counter. They offered discounts. They bundled financing. They rebranded older engines as classic. But the market had already spoken. Heritage no longer held weight without relevance. And the Urai wasn't just relevant, it was aspirational. Even longtime Harley fans began exploring options. Some purchased a Urai and kept their touring bike parked. Others sold off collections entirely, calling it the end of an era online. And younger riders who once saw motorcycles as a lifestyle fossil now saw a future, just not one with a bar and shield on it. As consumer loyalty cracked, political pressure hardened into something sharper: protectionism. If you're still watching, you know this isn't just a bike story, it's a shift in power, politics, and identity. Subscribe now if you're ready to follow the fallout, because the final chapter isn't written yet. Trade fences rise. The international fallout came fast. Within 2 months of Shinsei's global rollout, multiple US-based trade lobbies filed formal complaints. Their argument? The Urai engine represented unfair competitive advantage due to offshore manufacturing, state-sponsored tech grants, and manipulated compliance pathways. In simpler terms, they wanted it blocked. In Washington, lawmakers sympathetic to Harley's legacy called for tariff adjustments. One senator from Wisconsin declared, "We don't just build motorcycles, we build American identity." But the problem was nuance. Shinsei had done everything by the book. The Urai was emissions legal, IP certified, and met all known safety standards. Blocking it outright would risk triggering retaliation. Meanwhile, other nations pushed back. Germany called the tariffs thinly veiled protectionism. Japan labeled the complaint unfounded. Even Brazil, a rising motorcycle market, sided with Shinsei, citing rider demand and open market necessity. What resulted wasn't a full trade war, but a cold one. Import taxes rose. Environmental lobbyists clashed with performance advocates. Shinsei delayed shipments to certain U.S. ports, citing logistical reevaluation. And through it all, Harley remained silent, watching a battle it once would have led unfold without them. They hadn't just lost control of the conversation, they'd lost their place in the geopolitical machinery. And behind all the noise, one final decision waited to be made: evolve or disappear. End of an era or evolution. The showroom lights were still on. The engines still ran. But something fundamental had shifted. Harley-Davidson, once a symbol of defiance and dominance, now felt suspended in memory. More museum than machine. In interviews, former executives spoke of legacy, icon status, and brand perseverance. But current riders wanted none of it. They wanted speed, handling, purpose, and in that metric, the V-twin had become a relic. The company faced a choice: reinvent entirely, or fade gradually into the background of its own history. Not just a product shift, but a soul transplant. A redefinition so total that it risked alienating the very culture it once commanded. But that's what evolution demands. Pain, change, ego sacrifice. In Milwaukee, a new task force was assembled. Younger engineers, outside consultants, a mandate to redesign the brand from scratch. No more half measures, no more chrome distractions. If Harley was going to matter again, it couldn't just catch up. It had to leap forward, past its rivals, past its myth, past its past. Because if it didn't, the Urai wouldn't just be the engine that disrupted Harley, it would be the one that wrote its obituary. If you've made it this far, you already know. This isn't just about an engine. It's about legacy, survival, and what happens when a giant falls asleep at the throttle. Harley didn't just get challenged, they got outclassed. And whether they rise or vanish depends on what comes next. So if you care about power, innovation, and the brands that shaped an entire culture, hit subscribe. Drop your thoughts in the comments, because the loudest voices aren't coming from the factories anymore.